Hi there, I'm Ray. Welcome to another quick Tea Breaks reviews where I talk about the books which I read in August. August was a really good reading month in terms of sofa's falling over. August was a really good reading month in terms of I loved everything that I read in August. I had 2 rereads, which were real comfort reads, and 2 new reads, which gets me back on track with what I aim to read as a minimum, which is 1 book a week, following a few months of not reading as much as I would like to be reading. So I'll start with the rereads actually, because these were my favourites of the books that I read, even though I loved everything I read. And the first reread was Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder, and I actually listened to this as an audiobook version, which includes somebody playing the fiddle for Pa, and it's just such a lovely addition to the story to have the music actually there as music. Pa's fiddle and the music in Laura's childhood is a really big theme and part of this book, so it was really wonderful to hear that as part of the audiobook. And this is the first book in the Little House on the Prairie series. I loved this series as a child, and I was really struck listening to this book as an adult by just how well it reads as an adult, how full of innocence and charm and warmth this book is, whilst also really conveying the danger that was ever present in the lives of the Ingalls family living out in the woods of Wisconsin. I think Laura is just such an incredible storyteller. This is effectively one of those plotless stories where nothing really happens, you just follow the characters through a year in their life and you get lots of short little vignette style stories. And yet I was kind of on the edge of my seat really throughout the book. There are some parts where stories are told of, coming across wild bears in the forest or whatever it may be, and they're told so well that you're just there like child Laura, listening and hooked on every word and wanting to know what happens next. All of the domestic detail is fascinating. Their lives are so different to the way that we live today, and yet Laura captures and preserves this in a way that just makes it feel like it will live on forever. I was really moved by the ending of this book, and it reads, "She thought to herself, 'This is now.' She was glad that the cosy house and Pa and Ma and the firelight and the music were now. They could not be forgotten," she thought, "because now is now. It can never be a long time ago." That ending just really captures for me this whole book, the way that it captures a point in time so wonderfully and preserves it so that we can go back and relive it in the modern day. And yeah, I was just really blown away by re-experiencing this charming story, and I'm definitely planning on listening to the rest of the series through the same audiobooks because the narrator read them really well, and like I said, it was a really lovely touch to also have Pa's fiddle playing for the musical parts of the book. Next, I had a reread of Emily of Deep Valley, which I actually read only in December. This is probably the closest to my initial read that I've ever done a reread. But I was at a point where I only had 3 physical books in the house because we've just moved to our new house and all my books are in shipping at the moment. But I happen to have this one here. And I went through a few days where I was feeling particularly low, and I really think of Emily of Deep Valley as the best pick-me-up book. It tells the story of Emily. She is, I guess, around 17 or 18. All of her friends go off to college and she has to stay behind to look after her grandfather. And she initially kind of sees it as this lost winter, as this time in her life where she's not making any progress, she's not got meaningful work, she's not got romance, she's just kind of, her life feels totally lacking and stagnant whilst all of her friends are growing and experiencing. And she gets really down about this, understandably, but she also then works to take steps to tackle this. And we see her grow and develop and find romance and make her life's work meaningful. And it's just such a beautiful story. I adore Emily. She's a character who holds all of my heart. She's quite quiet, she's quite shy, but she's also really good at debating. So she has areas in her life where she's capable of being really confident, but that doesn't translate into absolutely every single area of her life, which I think is so true and is something that is so rarely shared in literature, is that confidence varies depending on our circumstances. And most of us have wavering levels of confidence depending on who we're around and what we're doing and that sort of thing. So I really loved that. I enjoyed this just as much on a reread as I did on my initial read, and yeah, it was just so lovely to spend time with these characters and in this world again. The first of the books which weren't rereads that I listened to was The Hart's Invisible Furies by John Boyne. I've heard this book absolutely raved about, and it's definitely deserving of its praise. It's a book that reminded me very, very much of a kind of Dickensian coming-of-age story, but set much more in the modern day, and it follows our protagonist Cyril Avery from conception up until his old age, and by following his trajectory we also follow the political changes that take place in Ireland from the 1940s or so up to the modern day, and also the progression of LGBTQ plus rights over that arc of time. And it was just incredibly effective, the way that we see the growth and changes in our individual characters and in society over this long length of time. It's a book which is in many ways really heartbreaking, really hard-hitting. It's not easy to read about. There's an awful lot of horrendous homophobia, of horrendous misogyny, violence and things throughout the novel. But at the same time, and I think this is why it reminds me of Dickens so much, it's filled with these hilarious, eccentric characters with these really funny little observations, which actually makes the reading of it a delight, even though if you were to just see the plot line written down by itself, it probably wouldn't sound like a book that you were going to enjoy. And John Boyne he was such a good storyteller. The story kept you hooked, you wanted to know what was happening at each point. I loved the way that different characters kind of wove back in at later points in the book. And yeah, it was a thoroughly enjoyable and moving read. My only kind of regret with this one really is that I was incredibly busy during the time that I was listening to it, so I never really managed to become fully immersed in it in a way that I wanted to. I think this would be a perfect book to take with you on holiday, for example, when you just got a chunk of time, because it's a fairly long novel, like a big chunk of time, and you can just get totally lost in the world of this book. And the final book that I read is Euphoria by Lily King, another book that I thoroughly enjoyed. This is a book that was inspired by the work of Margaret Mead, who was an anthropologist working in the 1930s, and we follow this kind of love triangle which goes on between Nell Stone, her husband, and our narrator, Andrew, and all three of them are working as anthropologists out in this remote village in Papua New Guinea. I loved the look at early anthropology, what it was like, the role that women played in it, and there was this very meta examination of anthropology and the perspective that the anthropological results actually said more about the anthropologist than they perhaps did about the society that the anthropologist was analysing. The whole atmosphere was quite claustrophobic, quite intense, and it's also really interesting. You had these many contradictions throughout. You had the fecundity of the landscape, which was contrasted with Nell's inability to bear a child. You had this really isolated, remote village setting, and yet the constant impact and effect of the global events and the build-up to World War II, which were going on in the kind of wider landscape of the world. I really enjoyed this one, really enjoyed Lily King's writing, and enjoyed the historical fiction aspect of it. I just thought it was really fascinating and would highly recommend. So those were my August reads. Let me know in the comments what you read in August, or if you've read any of these, what your thoughts are on them. If you enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and subscribe if you don't already. It really does help this channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon in another video. Bye bye.